The water looks calm. A family wades in up to their knees on a warm Gulf morning. No waves. A flat turquoise sheet stretching to the horizon. Within minutes, one of them is 400 feet out and cannot get back. This coastline drowns more swimmers than any jagged, storm-hammered shore in America, and most of them died in water that looked exactly this gentle. The first answer is rip currents, but that explains only one of the ways Florida kills at the edge of the sea. Since 1935, the same trap has been swallowing people who never saw it. Here is the thing nobody tells you when you book the beach house. The places that look dangerous almost never are. A cliff coast with black rock and exploding surf frightens people into respect. They stand back. They watch the water and decide, correctly, that it wants to hurt them. Florida does the opposite. Florida sells you a photograph of paradise, and then delivers exactly that photograph, warm and clear and shallow and soft. And the softness is the mechanism. You have to understand that before anything else in this story makes sense, because everything that follows it is built on the same cruel joke. The danger here is not hidden behind bad weather or hard-to-reach terrain. It is hidden inside the exact features that make the coast feel safe. So let me show you the geography, because the geography is where it starts, and the geography is not an accident. Look at Florida from above, and it barely qualifies as land. It is a long, low limestone shelf sticking down into warm water, a peninsula with more than 8,000 miles of shoreline when you count every bay and barrier island and inlet, more coastline than any state in the lower 48. Almost nothing on it is high. The average elevation of the whole state is around 100 feet, and the coastal strip where nearly everyone actually lives and swims and vacations is a few feet above the sea at best. On the Gulf side, the west coast, the land does not so much end at the water as dissolve into it. The bottom slopes away so gradually that you can walk out 100 yards and still be standing. That gentle slope is the reason the Gulf beaches feel like a bathtub. It is also, as you will see, the reason they can kill you without a single tall wave. Put a real number on that gentleness, because the number is what makes the Gulf beaches feel the way they feel. The continental shelf off Florida's west coast, the West Florida Shelf, is one of the broadest and flattest in the world. In places, it runs out 250 to 300 kilometers before the bottom finally falls away into deep water, and its slope is almost unbelievably slight, on the order of 1 foot of drop for every 2,000 feet you travel, in some stretches even gentler than that. That is not a beach that shelves down into the sea. That is a beach that lies down and crawls out under the water for 150 miles. And that shallow, gradual bottom is exactly what makes the Gulf feel so safe. A wave rolling in across all that shallow water loses its energy long before it reaches you, dragging on the bottom the whole way. So the surf that arrives at the sand is small and soft and unthreatening. It is why the Gulf looks like a lake. It is why you can walk out so far and still stand. But that same flat, shallow shelf is the thing that builds the sandbars and digs the channels in the first place, because gentle waves working on a gentle bottom are exactly what piles the sand into long, parallel ridges and cuts the gaps between them. The softness of the water and the danger in the water are not two different features of the Gulf. They are the same feature. The shelf that steals the power out of the waves is the shelf that shapes the trap underneath them. And so the calmer and more inviting a Gulf beach looks, the more perfectly it may be arranged to drain water back out through a hidden channel, which is the cruelest possible relationship between how a place looks and how it behaves. On the Atlantic side, Beitzensteig Krainim Ititsaim to the east coast, the geometry is different, but the trap is just as well hidden. There the continental shelf drops faster, the surf is bigger, and the Gulf Stream runs close offshore. Inlets cut through the barrier islands at regular intervals, man-made and natural, and each inlet is a place where huge volumes of water are forced through a narrow gap on every tide, dragging sand and fish, and sometimes people. Ponce de Leon Inlet, near a town called New Smyrna Beach, is one of those gaps, and we will come back to it, because what lives in the churned brown water beside that inlet has given a single Florida county a title no one wants. But start on the Gulf side, because that is where the drownings cluster, and that is where the illusion is strongest. Picture the sea floor off a panhandle beach like Panama City Beach. It is not a smooth ramp. Wave action piles sand into long ridges that run parallel to the shore, sandbars, sometimes 2 or 3 of them in a row. Between you and the first bar, there is a trough of deeper water. The bar itself might be shallow enough to stand on, which is why you see people out past the breakers apparently walking on the sea. And here is the part that matters. Those bars are not continuous. They have gaps, low spots, channels cut through them, sometimes only a few yards wide. Now add the waves. Even on a calm-looking day, waves keep pushing water up and over those sandbars toward the beach. Water piles up in the trough between the bar and the shore. That water has to go somewhere. It cannot pile up forever. It looks for the lowest, easiest exit back out to sea, and the lowest, easiest exit is the gap in the sandbar. So all that accumulated water funnels sideways along the beach, finds the gap, and rushes out through it in a narrow, fast river flowing straight away from shore. That river is a rip current. That is the whole thing. There is no mystery to the physics. It is drainage. It is water finding a hole in a wall. But understand what that means for a body in the water. The rip is narrow, often only 10 to 30 feet wide, and it is fast. A strong rip can pull at 2, even 5 feet per second. An Olympic swimmer sprints at around 6 feet per second and cannot hold that for long. So the current in that channel can move faster than a strong adult can swim, and the average tourist is not a strong adult swimmer. The rip does not pull you under. That is the first myth to kill. It is not a whirlpool. It does not suck you down. It simply carries you out, away from the beach, past the sandbar, into deeper water. And it does it fast, and it does it silently, and it does it under a blue sky. What happens next is almost always the same. And it is the reason these currents are so lethal in a place that feels so safe. The swimmer feels themselves being carried away from the beach and does the only thing instinct allows. They turn toward shore and they try to swim back, straight back, directly against the current. And now they are on a treadmill running the wrong way, burning everything they have against a flow they cannot beat. And the water is warm, and the beach is right there, so close. And they keep fighting because stopping feels like giving up. Within a few minutes, the arms stop working. The swimmer goes vertical, head tilting back, mouth at the waterline, doing what lifeguards call climbing an invisible ladder. There is no splashing, no shouting, no waving. Drowning does not look like drowning. It is quiet and it is quick, and from the beach, it looks like nothing at all, which is why parents on the sand have watched it happen 40 yards away and never knew until it was over. The escape is almost insultingly simple, and the fact that so few people know it is part of the tragedy. You do not fight the rip. You cannot win. You either float and let it carry you out until it weakens and releases you past the bar, then swim in at an angle, or you swim parallel to the beach, sideways, out of the narrow channel and into the calmer water beside it. Then ride the waves back in. The rip is a river, not an ocean. Step out of the river, and you are fine. But every instinct in a frightened human body says, go straight for the land you can see. And that instinct is what the geography is waiting for. There is more to the machine than a single gap in a single bar, and the extra parts are what make it so hard to outguess. A rip current is not a steady thing that sits in one place and runs at one speed all day. It pulses. Waves do not arrive at the beach evenly, one exactly like the last. They come in sets, a run of larger waves followed by a lull of smaller ones, and each set shoves an extra load of water up over the bar and into the trough. That surplus has to drain, so the rip answers the sets. It surges. For a stretch of a minute or two, the channel can be running gently, almost invisibly, and a swimmer standing in it feels nothing worth worrying about. Then a set rolls in, the trough fills, the drain kicks hard, and the same channel that was mild a moment ago is suddenly pulling with everything it has. That is why people describe being fine 1 second and gone the next. They are not imagining it. They waded into the channel during a lull and got caught by the pulse. Tides load the machine too. On many of these beaches, the rip runs strongest around low tide, because that is when the water is shallow enough over the bars that the sand is doing the most to pen the water in and force it toward the gaps. A family that swam in perfect safety at midday can come back a few hours later to what looks like the identical patch of ocean and find that the falling tide has quietly turned the drain up. Nothing on the surface tells them. The water is the same color, the same warmth, the same gentle chop. The difference is underneath, in the geometry of sand and the stage of the tide, and neither of those is visible from a towel on the beach. Then there are the rips that never move at all, and those have a particular appetite for people because people are drawn straight to them. Anywhere a solid structure interrupts the beach, a fishing pier, a rock jetty at an inlet, a groin built to hold the sand, the water that piles up against that structure escapes along its edge in a permanent, fixed rip that runs there whenever the surf is up. It is not a wandering channel that opens and closes. It is a standing river of outflowing water pinned to the side of the pier, in the same spot, day after day. And a pier is exactly where an inexperienced swimmer wants to be. It is a landmark. It looks like a handrail into the sea, something solid to swim out to and hold on to. Parents point their kids toward it because it seems safer than the open beach. It is very often the single most dangerous piece of water on the whole shoreline, and the panhandle beaches with their long fishing piers have drowned people right beside the pilings, within sight and shouting distance of the people fishing overhead. None of this is secret knowledge held back from the public. The National Weather Service issues a rip current risk for these beaches every single day in season, low, moderate, or high, the same way it forecasts rain, and it broadcasts surf zone warnings, and the beach agencies fly their flags to match. The information exists. It is free, it is public, it is often accurate, and it collides with the same wall every time, which is that a forecast printed as low, moderate, or high, or a colored flag on a distant pole, has to survive contact with a human being who traveled a long way to enjoy the water, and who is looking at a warm, flat, beautiful sea that is doing an extraordinary job of contradicting the warning. A high rip current risk day on a Florida beach does not look dangerous. That is the entire problem in one sentence. The forecast says high, and the ocean says paradise, and the ocean is the more persuasive of the two, right up until the moment it stops being persuasive and starts being fatal. So who first learned to read this water? Not the tourists. The people who lived along these coasts for thousands of years before there were beach houses read the sea the way you read a road. The Calusa on the southwest Gulf Coast, the Tequesta near Biscayne Bay, the Ais and the Yaega along the central Atlantic shore, the Timucua across the north, these were maritime cultures. The Calusa in particular built a whole society on the water, on estuaries and shell mounds and canoe canals, without agriculture, living off the sea so successfully that they supported tens of thousands of people. You do not do that by fighting the water. You do it by understanding exactly where and when it turns dangerous, by knowing which passes run hard on which tide, by reading the color of the water and the break of the waves the way the modern beach patrol reads a flag chart. That knowledge was survival infrastructure, and it was as sophisticated in its way as any forecast. It was also almost entirely lost, wiped out by disease, enslaving, and displacement within a couple of centuries of European contact. And what replaced it was a very different relationship with the coast, not adaptation, marketing. It is worth staying with the Calusa a moment longer, because they are the clearest counterexample to everything the modern coast does wrong, and their story is documented well enough to make the contrast real rather than romantic. The Calusa ruled southwest Florida, the Charlotte Harbor estuaries, and the maze of mangrove islands down toward the 10,000 islands for well over 1,000 years, and they did it without farming. That fact alone should stop you. Almost every large, powerful, complex society in human history was built on agriculture, on growing surplus food from the land. The Calusa built their power on the water instead, on the fish and shellfish of the estuaries, so completely and so successfully that they supported a population in the tens of thousands, raised enormous mounds out of discarded shells, dug canals for their canoes, and dominated the other peoples of the region so thoroughly that they extracted tribute from them. When the Spanish arrived with their empire and their steel, the Calusa did not fold. They resisted for the better part of 2 centuries, and it was disease and the slave raids of colonization, not conquest in the field, that finally broke them. You do not build that kind of civilization on a dangerous coast by being lucky. You build it by knowing the water the way a surgeon knows a body, by reading the estuary and the tide and the sky with a precision refined over countless generations, by understanding exactly which passes run hard on which tide and when the weather is turning, and above all, by knowing when not to go out. That last piece is the one the modern coast has entirely lost. A people living from canoes in open estuaries with no engine to power through a squall and no radio to call for help survives by restraint, by reading the conditions and choosing, on the dangerous days, to simply stay ashore. Their whole relationship with the sea was built around adapting themselves to what the water was doing, because they had no power to make the water adapt to them. That is the exact inversion of the modern arrangement, and the inversion is the tragedy in miniature. The tourist does not adapt to the coast. The tourist arrives on a fixed schedule, a 1-week window bought and paid for, and expects the coast to cooperate, and goes into the water on the day the calendar says to go, not the day the water says it is safe. The knowledge that took the Calusa 1,000 years to build, the knowledge of when not to enter, has been replaced by a colored flag that most people cannot read and would override anyway. We did not just lose the old knowledge of this coast. We replaced it with a system that runs on the opposite principle, on bending the sea to a vacation schedule, and the water collects the difference exactly the way it always has. Because here is the modern version of the story. Florida does not ask you to read the water. Florida hands you a photograph and a flight and a rental car and tells you the water is a feature, an amenity, a thing you paid for. The people drowning in Gulf rips are overwhelmingly visitors, and disproportionately, they come from inland states with no coastline of their own, from Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and the interior of Alabama and Georgia. They arrive at the beach with no cultural knowledge of the sea whatsoever, no instinct trained by growing up next to it, and they walk into water that is warm and shallow and clear and gives them every reason to trust it. The demographic that dies most is exactly who you would predict once you understand the trap. Males, often young, often strong enough to believe they can swim against anything, often fathers, often at beaches with no lifeguard anywhere in sight. And that word, lifeguard, is where the modern system starts to fail out loud. Consider Panama City Beach on the Panhandle, one of the most visited stretches of the entire Gulf Coast, drawing something like 4.5 million visitors a year to its white sand. For much of that beach, there is no lifeguard sitting in a tower watching the water. There is no continuous patrolled swimming zone, the way you would find at a municipal beach in California. What there is, instead, is a flag. Colored flags on poles, a warning system, green for low hazard, yellow for medium, red for high, double red for water, closed to the public. It is the internationally recognized system, and on paper, it is reasonable. In practice, it asks a tourist who has never seen the ocean before to look at a purple or a yellow or a red flag and correctly translate it into a life or death decision, and then to act on that decision while standing on a beautiful beach he flew 1,000 miles to enjoy, with his kids already running for the water. Bay County, which includes Panama City Beach, understands the flag problem well enough that it made a telling decision. It does not fly green flags, ever. Officials there decided that green, the color that says low hazard, calm conditions, safe, was too dangerous to display because rip currents can be present under a clear sky and a gentle surf. And a green flag would tell people exactly the wrong thing about exactly the water that kills them. So the calmest flag you will ever see on that beach is yellow. Think about what that admits. They removed the safe option from the chart because the water is never quite safe enough to promise it. Now watch what happens when that system meets a bad week. In June of 2023, Panama City Beach became the deadliest beach in the United States, and it did it in about 9 days. Between the 15th and the 24th of that month, 7 people drowned there. 7. In one small stretch of the Panhandle, in a little over a week, in water that on most of those days did not look particularly violent to anyone standing on the sand. The National Weather Service, which keeps the national tally of surf zone deaths, would end the year listing Panama City Beach as the single deadliest beach location in the country for 20,000, as a 2023. Pull the days apart, and the pattern inside them is the thing that should frighten you. 6 of those 7 died in rip currents over a tight window from the 20th to the 23rd. And the flags. Here is what the record actually shows, because it matters and because it is not the simple story you would expect. In 5 of the 6 rip current incidents that June, the beach was flying single red flags, high hazard, swim at your own risk, the water still legally open. In only 1 case had the flags gone to double red, water closed, and even that one happened right as officials were in the act of changing the flags over. So the popular version, the one where everyone ignored a clear double red warning and paid for it, is not quite true. Most of these people entered water that the official system had marked as dangerous, but not closed. They saw a red flag, if they saw it at all, and they made the same calculation millions of people make every summer, that the water looked fine, that they would just go into their waist, that they were strong enough, that red is a warning and not a wall. One of those days is the one that stays with the deputies who worked it. On the evening of the 21st, 3 young men from Alabama went for a swim as the light was going. Evening swim, warm water, the end of a good day. All 3 were caught in the same rip, and all 3 drowned. A single current, in a single stretch of water that had drawn no particular alarm, took 3 lives at once. And it did it not in a storm, but on an ordinary Gulf evening, under a sky that was doing nothing dramatic at all. And that Panama City Beach cluster was not an isolated freak. It sat inside a wider, deadlier season that stretched along the whole northern rim of the Gulf. In that same early summer of 2023, as the rip currents kept firing along the Panhandle and over into the Alabama beaches next door, the toll across the region climbed into double digits, 10, then a dozen dead in a matter of weeks, along the Gulf Coast, the great majority of them in rip currents, most of them visitors. The Panhandle was the epicenter, but the mechanism did not respect the county line because the geography does not stop at the state border. It is the same shelf, the same bars, the same warm, shallow water curving along the northern Gulf, and it was killing people up and down that curve all summer? Look at who dies, and the trap sharpens into focus. The typical surf zone victim, the National Weather Service will tell you, is male, often young, somewhere between the ages of 10 and their late 20s, which is to say exactly the population most confident in the water and least willing to believe a warm, calm sea could beat them. Layer on top of that the geography of where the victims come from. Over and over, they are from inland, from states with no coast, arriving with no trained instinct for reading the sea, treating the ocean like a bigger version of a lake or a pool. The 3 young men from Alabama fit it. The 68-year-old from Tennessee bitten by the shark fit it. The pattern is not that Florida's water is uniquely violent. It is that Florida takes a quietly dangerous shallow sea and pours onto it by the tens of millions, precisely the people least prepared to recognize when it turns. And it does this at beaches where, more often than not, there is no professional standing by to correct the mistake in the 90 seconds it takes to become fatal. That is the first proof, and it establishes the shape of everything that follows. The danger here is not weather you can see coming. It is geography you cannot see at all. A rip current does not announce itself with black clouds and howling wind. It is a quiet drainage channel in the sand, invisible from the beach, active on beautiful days. And it kills disproportionately the people least equipped to recognize it, at beaches least equipped to rescue them. Florida averages around 19 rip current deaths a year going back over 3 decades. And in a bad year like 2021, the number climbed to 28, more than any state in the country. Stack that up over time, and you reach a genuinely disturbing fact. In Florida, rip currents kill more people, on average, than hurricanes, tropical storms, tornadoes, severe thunderstorms, and lightning combined. The thing that kills the most is the thing that scares people the least. But there is a second proof folded inside the first one. And it is worse, because it turns the ocean's most human impulse into part of the machinery. The 3 men from Alabama were together. The parents who drown in Florida rips are very often not the first person into the water. They are the second. Because when a child or a friend or a spouse gets caught in a rip and starts to struggle, the person on the beach does not stand there and calculate. They go in. Of course they go in. Every decent instinct you have is screaming at you to go in, and so you do. And now the rip has 2 people instead of 1, and the second person is usually the stronger swimmer. The parent, the rescuer, which means the second person is the one who exhausts themselves trying to hold up someone who is panicking and grabbing and climbing that invisible ladder up their body towards air. The numbers on this are grim and specific. Studies of rip current fatalities find that just over 15% of them are bystanders, people who were safe on the beach and went in to save someone else. Family members most often. The second largest category of rip current deaths is not the original swimmer at all. It is the person who tried to help. And there is a pattern inside that pattern that is almost too cruel to state plainly. In a meaningful number of these cases, the original victim survives, and the rescuer does not. The child gets washed back to a sandbar and stands up. The father does not come back. The rip released the light, exhausted, floating body of the kid and kept the heavier, thrashing, fighting body of the adult who spent everything he had. There are named cases you can trace. A father in Florida who pulled his 8-year-old daughter out of a rip and got her to safety and then went under himself, gone, in front of the beach. A mother who went in after her children and did not come back while the children lived. These are not rare exceptions dressed up for a headline. They are the predictable output of a system that combines an invisible current, an unpatrolled beach, and the one human reflex you cannot train out of people, which is to go into the water after your own kid. And this is what deepens the trap from a fact of physics into something almost designed. An unguarded beach does not just remove the professional who might have made the rescue safely. It guarantees that the only rescuer available is an untrained, terrified family member, arriving too fast, with no flotation, swimming straight into the same channel that is already winning. The lifeguard who is not there would have brought a rescue tube, would have known to swim parallel, would have known not to let a drowning person climb him. The father has none of that. He has love and adrenaline, and about 90 seconds of strength, and the geometry of the rip converts all three into a second body. Now put a trained lifeguard back into that picture, because the single most important variable in whether a Florida beach kills you is not the flag color, and it is not your swimming ability. It is whether someone is watching. The United States Life-Saving Association keeps the national numbers, and the numbers are almost unbelievable. Averaged over the last decade of records, the chance that a person will die by drowning at a beach protected by USLA lifeguards is about 1 in 18 million. 1 in 18 million. You are statistically safer in the surf in front of a lifeguard tower than doing almost anything else you could do on your vacation, including the drive to the beach. And at a beach with no lifeguard, the same organization calculates the risk of drowning at roughly 5 times higher. That multiple is the whole argument. It is not that the water in front of the tower is calmer. Often it is the exact same water, the same bars, the same rips. The difference is a person in a red uniform whose entire job is to read the channel you cannot see and reach you inside the 2 or 3 minutes you have, because 2 or 3 minutes is really all you have. And this is the part that turns an unwatched beach into a death trap regardless of how strong a swimmer you are. Drowning is fast, and it is quiet. A person fighting a rip does not thrash and scream the way the movies taught you. They go into what researchers call the instinctive drowning response, arms pressing down on the water in a futile attempt to lever the mouth up to breathe, head tilted back, unable to wave, unable to call out, because the body will not spare a breath for shouting when it is drowning. From the beach, it looks like someone bobbing, maybe playing, maybe just floating. It looks like nothing. And underwater, the clock is merciless. Submerge a person, and within a minute or two, they lose consciousness. And after 4 to 6 minutes without air, the brain begins to die. That is the window. That is the entire margin. A lifeguard trained to spot the instinctive drowning response can launch and cover 100 yards inside that window. A father on a towel who finally realizes something is wrong at minute 3 is already too late, and the strangers around him do not even know it is happening, because it does not look like an emergency until it is over. So think about what an unguarded beach actually is once you understand that clock. It is not a beach that is a little less safe. It is a beach where the only rescuer who can arrive inside the survival window is, by definition, a bystander with no training, no float, and no idea that the calm-looking channel is already pulling the person out faster than they can swim. It guarantees the worst possible rescue, delivered too late by the person least equipped to survive it, which is exactly the mechanism that turns 1 drowning into 2. And a great deal of Florida's most visited coastline is exactly that kind of beach. Long stretches of the Panhandle have no fixed lifeguard coverage at all. The system there is the flag and the sign, and the printed forecast, an information system, not a rescue system. And information does not swim out and pull anyone in. The scale of what those lifeguards handle where they do exist tells you how relentless the rips really are. USLA agencies rescue somewhere on the order of 70,000 people from the surf in a typical year across the country, and in a busy year, the number climbs toward 80,000. And when they break down why, the answer is overwhelming and consistent. More than 80% of all those rescues are rip currents. Not sharks, which account for essentially none of it. Not storms. Not big dramatic surf. 4 out of every 5 people a lifeguard drags back to the sand were caught by the quiet drainage channel in otherwise ordinary water. That is the true face of the danger. written in the rescue logs of the people who deal with it professionally, and it points at the same invisible current the whole beach is trained by instinct to ignore. The thing that requires the most rescues is the thing that looks like nothing, which brings up the flags again. And a harder truth about them, because it is tempting to say the answer is simply better warnings and smarter tourists. The trouble is that the warning system assumes a literacy that most beachgoers do not have. Study after study of ordinary people on ordinary beaches finds that a large share of them cannot correctly say what the colored flags mean. They see a red flag and read it as a general caution. The way you might read a yellow traffic light, slow down, be a little careful, rather than what it actually is, which is a warning that the water is capable of killing a strong adult that afternoon. Double red means the water is closed, legally closed, and yet people wade in under double red every summer, because a beautiful warm sea under a blue sky is telling them a story so much more convincing than a piece of colored cloth on a pole. The flag is fighting the entire sensory experience of the beach, and the flag usually loses. And the reason all of this matters so much, the reason a hidden current on a few beaches becomes one of the deadliest coastlines in the country, is a number that has nothing to do with waves and everything to do with people. Florida draws well over 130 million visitors a year now, more than any state, a figure that has been breaking its own records, climbing past 140 million. Pour that many human beings onto low, warm, gently shelving beaches, a huge share of them from inland places with no coast of their own and no instinct for the sea. Many of them at unguarded stretches of sand reading flags they do not understand, and you do not need the water to be exotically dangerous. You just need it to be quietly dangerous, reliably, on beautiful days. And then you need to feed it an almost limitless supply of people who have every reason to trust it. The rip current does not have to be rare or violent to lead the nation in deaths. It only has to be invisible and constant, and standing between 140 million trusting visitors and the warm water they flew in to enjoy. It is worth sitting inside the decision itself, the actual moment a person chooses to walk into water that a flag has warned them about. Because if you do not understand that moment, you will keep making the lazy mistake of calling these people foolish. And they are not foolish. They are human, in a very specific and predictable set of circumstances that the coast exploits perfectly. Start with what the trip cost them. A family on a panhandle beach in June did not wander down absent-mindedly. They planned this for months. They paid for the flights or drove 10, 12 hours through the night with kids in the back. They paid for the condo. This 1 week is the vacation, the thing the whole year was pointing at, and the entire reason they came is the water. Now they are standing on the sand, and there is a red flag on a distant pole, and the water in front of them looks, to every sense they have, absolutely fine, warm, flat, beautiful. Other families are already in it, laughing, standing waist-deep, perfectly alive. Think about what the flag is actually asking of that family in that moment. It is asking them to look at calm water full of happy people, on the 1 week they saved all year for, and voluntarily not go in, on the say-so of a colored cloth, against the evidence of their own eyes and the example of every other person on the beach. Almost nobody makes that choice. Not because they are reckless, but because every force acting on them, the money spent, the time invested, the beauty in front of them, the crowd already in the water, points the same direction toward the sea. The crowd matters more than people admit. Human beings read safety from other humans. If dozens of people are already in the water and nothing bad is visibly happening, your brain files the water as safe, because that is how your brain has kept you alive your whole life, by watching what everyone else survives. But a rip current does not empty the whole beach at once. It takes one person from one narrow channel quietly, while 40 feet away the water genuinely is calmer, and the other swimmers genuinely are fine. So the crowd is not lying to you exactly, but it is giving you an average when the danger is local. Most of the water is safe most of the time. The channel is not, and the crowd cannot tell you which is which, because the crowd standing in the safe water looks identical to the crowd that is about to stand in the wrong spot on a falling tide when the next big set rolls through. Then add the simple, stubborn optimism that rides in every one of us. The warning is general, and you are specific. Bad things happen to other people, statistically, distantly. The red flag is talking about some abstract, dangerous swimmer, not you, not your strong teenager who was on the swim team, not your husband who grew up around water. This is the same quiet machinery that lets people smoke and speed and skip the sunscreen. The belief that the odds printed on the warning are describing a stranger. On a beach, it is nearly irresistible, because the threat is invisible and the reward is right there and warm. And the towns know it. They know that people will go in under a single red flag, which is why the flag is a warning and not a fence, and they only reach for the double red, the actual closure with a fine attached, when they have decided the water is now killing people faster than warnings can slow it down. The whole system runs on a gamble that most people, on most days, in most of the water, will be fine. And most people on most days are. The coastline collects its toll from the small, steady percentage for whom the gamble comes due, and there is a fresh crowd of 140 million every year to draw that percentage from. So the calm water hides a killer. Fine. You could tell yourself you will simply stay out of the deep, keep to your waist, watch the flags, never go in after anyone without a float. You could decide that the drownings are, at bottom, a problem of ignorance, solvable by education. And you would be partly right. But the coast has more than one way to hurt you, and the next one lives in water so murky you cannot see your own feet, at the exact inlet I mentioned earlier, and it has earned a Florida county the strangest dangerous place title in the world. Because if you ask most people what they are afraid of at the Florida shore, they will not say the invisible drainage channel that actually does the killing. They will say the thing with teeth. Volusia County sits on the Atlantic side of Florida, a stretch of the central east coast that includes Daytona Beach and, just to its south, the surf town of New Smyrna Beach. It is an ordinary-looking place. White sand, good waves, a working inlet, families and surfers sharing the same water. And it holds a record that the International Shark Attack File, the global database kept at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida, has documented for decades. More people are bitten by sharks in Volusia County than anywhere else on Earth, not anywhere else in Florida. Anywhere else on the planet. New Smyrna Beach is, by the count that scientists actually keep, the shark bite capital of the world. The numbers are not close. Since the file began tracking, back to 1882, Volusia County has logged well over 300 shark bites, a figure more than double that of the next county on the list, its own neighbor Brevard. New Smyrna Beach alone accounts for the great majority of them. In a busy year, the beach sees somewhere between 5 and 10 bites, sometimes more, sometimes several in a single day. Occasionally, 2 or 3 people bitten within the same 24 hours, at the same stretch of sand. If you go looking for the deadliest sounding statistic to justify the title in the hook, this is the one that jumps out first. The world's most bitten coast. It sounds like the end of the argument. It is, in fact, where the argument turns completely around, and this is the reversal you need to sit with, because it teaches the single most important lesson in this entire story. Go and read the New Smyrna Beach entry carefully, and you find the thing nobody expects. Despite more than a century of bites, despite hundreds of people carried out of that water with their feet and hands and calves torn open, New Smyrna Beach has never recorded a single fatal shark attack. Not one. The place that bites more human beings than any coast on the planet has never killed a person with a shark. The most feared predator in the ocean, at the exact spot where it bites people more than anywhere on Earth, is functionally not a lethal threat at all. To understand why, you have to go back to the inlet and the murky water. New Smyrna sits right beside Ponce de Leon Inlet, one of those gaps in the barrier island where every tide flushes a massive volume of water in and out. That flushing does two things. It stirs the sand into a permanent brown murk, so the water there is rarely clear. And it concentrates baitfish, dense schools of mullet and menhaden, funneled through the inlet and along the beach. Where the baitfish go, the sharks follow. And the sharks that follow are mostly small, mostly black tips and spinner sharks, 3 to 5 feet long, fast, and hunting in water where they can barely see. Now add the other animal that loves that same spot for the same waves and the same energy, surfers. Dozens of them in the same murky, bait-fish-thick, shark-thick water, kicking pale hands and feet that flash and flutter exactly like a panicked fish. The bite, when it comes, is almost always a mistake. A small shark in cloudy water sees a flash of movement, a flicker that reads as prey, and it does what a predator does. It bites, and then, almost instantly, it realizes the thing in its mouth is not a mullet. It is a human foot. Too big, wrong texture, wrong everything, and the shark lets go and leaves. It is a case of mistaken identity, over in a second. An exploratory bite from a small animal that immediately regrets it. The result is a nasty wound, stitches, sometimes serious damage to a foot or hand, a story the surfer will tell for the rest of his life. It is almost never a fatality because these are not large sharks trying to eat a person. They are small sharks that grabbed the wrong thing in bad visibility and spat it back out. The timing of the bites gives the whole thing away because it is not random and it is not the sharks hunting people it runs on a fish calendar. From late fall through the early spring, roughly November into March, huge schools of mullet and other baitfish migrate south along Florida's Atlantic coast, and the blacktip and spinner sharks come with them, tens of thousands of them, strung along the shoreline following the food. The bites cluster where and when the baitfish are thickest and the water is most churned, right in the surf zone at New Smyrna, right where the inlet keeps everything stirred to a coffee-colored murk. Put a surfer's pale hand or dangling foot into water, where a small shark is snapping at fleeing mullet it can barely see, and the mistake makes itself. The shark is not deciding to attack a person. It is hunting fish in bad light and grabbing the wrong shape. The pace of it, when a run is on, would sound like a horror movie if you did not know the truth behind the numbers. There are days at New Smyrna when the beach logs multiple bites within hours of each other. In one stretch in the summer of 2019, 3 people were bitten in the same waters over just 2 days, among them a 68-year-old man visiting from Nashville, Tennessee, bitten on the foot, the kind of inland visitor who threads through this whole story. 3 victims, 2 days, 1 beach. Anywhere else on Earth that would be a national emergency, helicopters overhead, the water closed for a month. At New Smyrna, it is a busy week. The victims got stitched up and went home with a story, because the animal that bit them was a 3-foot fish hunter that let go the instant it realized its error, not a predator that wanted them. Now hold that fact up against everything you just learned about rip currents, because the contrast is the whole point. The shark is the thing everyone fears. It has the fin and the teeth and the music. It is the reason some people will not go past their knees. And at the very beach where sharks bite humans, more than anywhere on Earth, the shark has killed no one. Meanwhile, the quiet drainage channel a few feet away, the thing with no fin and no teeth and no music, the thing nobody photographs or makes movies about, is out killing hurricanes. Danger and lethality are not the same axis. The feature that frightens you and the feature that kills you are, on this coast, almost never the same feature. That is the trap restated in a new language. Fear points you at the shark and leaves your back turned to the water that actually drowns you. There is a bleak footnote here worth adding, because it shows how completely the fear is misdirected. On the rare occasions Florida sharks do kill, it tends to be a different animal in a different place. A bull shark or a larger predator in clearer or deeper water. And those events are so uncommon that each one becomes national news for a week. The routine, the everyday, the statistically overwhelming reality is the opposite. A coast where the sharks bite constantly and kill essentially never, and where the calm water kills constantly and frightens no one. If you were an engineer designing a place to fool human risk perception as badly as possible, you could not do better than the Florida shore. It aims your fear at the safe threat and hides the deadly one inside the postcard. So the water lies to you twice. It looks calm when it is draining, and it hides its most feared predator behind a statistic that turns out to mean the opposite of what it sounds like. You might think at this point that the pattern is clear and the lesson is learned. Distrust the water, respect the invisible, ignore the movie monster. But the coast is not finished, and the next killer does not come from the water at all. It comes from above, and it arrives before the storm you would use to predict it, and it kills the person who did everything right except look up. Florida is the lightning capital of the United States, and it has been for as long as anyone has kept the records that decide such things. Measured by deaths, no state kills more people with lightning. Measured by density, the number of lightning strikes per square mile, the peninsula lights up on the national maps like a struck match, year after year. A bright, hot smear over central Florida while most of the country stays dark. The company Vaisala, which runs a national lightning detection network and tracks these strikes down to the individual bolt, has put Florida at or near the top of that ranking for years. There is even a specific corridor, a band across the center of the state roughly between Tampa, on the Gulf side, and the Space Coast near Titusville on the Atlantic side, that gets called Lightning Alley because it is one of the most electrically violent stretches of ground in the entire hemisphere. And like everything else on this coast, the reason is the geography. And the reason turns the peninsula's greatest asset into a loaded gun. Florida is a narrow finger of warm land, with the Gulf of Mexico on one side and the Atlantic on the other. On a summer morning, the land heats up faster than the water. Hot air rises off the land, and cooler, moister air flows in from both coasts to replace it. These are the sea breezes, and they are lovely. They are the thing that makes a Florida afternoon bearable, a gentle push of ocean air off the water. But there are two of them, one coming in from the Gulf and one coming in from the Atlantic, and they are marching toward each other across a narrow peninsula. In the middle of the state, in the afternoon, they collide. When they collide, they have nowhere to go but up, and they shove enormous volumes of warm, wet air violently upward into the sky, and that rising wet air is the raw fuel of the thunderstorm. It builds towering clouds, tens of thousands of feet high, in a matter of hours, almost every summer afternoon, and those clouds throw lightning. Something like 80% of Florida's lightning is born from these sea breeze collisions. The same daily ocean breezes that make the coast livable are the engine that makes the sky lethal. Now put a person on the beach under that sky. The beach is the worst possible place to be. It is flat, it is open, there is no shelter, and the tallest thing standing on the wet sand at the edge of a conducting sheet of salt water is a human being. Lightning does not require the storm to be on top of you. This is the part that kills. A bolt can travel horizontally out of the top of a thunderstorm and strike the ground 10 miles from the rain, out of a sky that, from where the victim is standing, still looks blue. They call it a bolt from the blue for a reason. The people who get killed on Florida beaches are frequently not standing in a downpour ignoring the obvious. They are standing in sunshine, watching a dark cloud that is still comfortably far away, doing the math that any reasonable person would do, that the storm is over there and they are over here, and there is time for one more swim. And then the sky reaches out 10 miles and finds them. The physics of why the beach is so lethal under that sky is worth being precise about, because it explains why the ordinary, reasonable judgment gets people killed. Lightning is looking for the easiest path between the charged cloud and the ground, and it tends to find that path through whatever sticks up highest from a flat, conductive surface. A wide-open beach at the edge of a sheet of salt water is about as flat and conductive a surface as exists, and the tallest thing on it is a standing human being. You do not have to be the tallest thing for miles. You just have to be the tallest thing right there on your patch of sand, and a person standing on an empty beach is exactly that. Worse, the shelters people instinctively run to are not shelters at all. A wooden lifeguard stand, a beach umbrella, a lone palm, a picnic pavilion, none of these protect you, and a tall, isolated object can actually raise your risk by drawing the strike to the ground near where you are sheltering. The only real safety is a substantial building or a hard-topped vehicle, and on a long stretch of open beach, those can be a long, exposed sprint away. Then there is the timing, which is where good judgment betrays people. The safety rule the National Weather Service teaches is blunt. When thunder roars, go indoors. And the reason it is that strict comes straight from that horizontal reach. Because the strike can come from a part of the sky that is not raining on you, the sound of thunder, not the sight of rain, is your only reliable warning that you have already entered the danger zone. If you can hear thunder at all, you are close enough to be hit. But a person on a beach does the sensible-seeming thing instead. They watch the dark cloud on the horizon. They judge the distance. They decide there is time, and they stay in the warm water for one more few minutes, because leaving a beautiful beach for a storm that has not arrived feels absurd. And the beach, which asks you to stay low and near the shore to be safe from the water, has now put you flat and exposed at the edge of the sea, under the one hazard that punishes you for being there before its cloud ever reaches you. The victims fit the same profile you are now getting used to. Overwhelmingly, they are outdoors doing something ordinary and pleasant. In 2025, Florida again led the nation in lightning deaths. 4 people killed, all of them men, all of them enjoying the outdoors. One of them struck while wading in the ocean at New Smyrna Beach. Read that again because the geography has folded back on itself in a way that is almost too neat. New Smyrna Beach, the shark bite capital of the world, where the sharks bite constantly and kill no one, is also a place where a man standing in the water was killed, not by anything in the sea, but by the sky above it. The threat everyone came to fear, the one with teeth, has never killed there. The water drowned people, and the sky electrocuted one, and the animal on the poster did neither. That is the third layer. And notice what it has done to your sense of where the danger lives. It is not in the deep water only. It is not in the surf zone only. It is not even in the water at all. The lightning kills the person standing safely in the shallows, the person who obeyed every rip current rule, the person who never went out past their waist. It punishes correct behavior, because the rules that keep you safe from drowning, stay shallow, stay near shore, stay where you can stand, put you out in the open on a flat, wet beach directly under the one hazard that comes from above. Solving one danger can walk you straight into another. The coast has more than one way in, and closing one door opens another. There is a live scientific argument worth being honest about here, because this story does not need to cheat to be frightening. In very recent years, the title of Lightning Capital has actually been contested. A newer analysis from an environmental research firm looked at flash density and found Oklahoma edging out Florida in a given year by a razor-thin margin, something like 73 flashes per square mile against Florida's 72.9. So depending on exactly what you measure, strikes per area in one particular year, or deaths over the long run, or total lightning count, the ranking can shift. What is not in serious dispute is the human toll. When it comes to actually killing people with lightning, year in and year out, Florida sits at the top, because Florida combines the electrical violence of those sea breeze storms with the one thing Oklahoma does not have: hundreds of miles of crowded, exposed, treeless beach, filled all summer with people who flew in to stand in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time of day. So now you have three killers, and they share a single design. The rip current hides inside calm water. The shark hides inside a statistic that means the opposite of what it sounds like. The lightning hides inside a blue sky and a distant, harmless-looking cloud. Each one is invisible or misread right up until the moment it is not, and each one preferentially takes the person who trusted the surface of things. But all three so far have been retail killers, one at a time. A swimmer here, a surfer there, a waiter under a clear sky. Terrible, repeated, cumulative, but individual. To understand why this coast earns its reputation at a completely different scale, you have to stop looking at the single body in the water and start looking at what happens when the whole ocean stands up at once and walks onto the land. And the first time it did that to a modern Florida crowd, it did not catch seasoned islanders who knew the water. It caught a city full of newcomers who had come chasing a fortune and had never in their lives seen a hurricane on a warm night in the late summer of 1926. In the middle of the 1920s, Miami was the fastest, giddiest boomtown in America. A real estate frenzy had pulled hundreds of thousands of people down to the southeast Florida coast in just a few years. Buyers and speculators and dreamers, most of them from the North and the Midwest, most of them brand new to the place. They bought lots sight unseen. They built houses and hotels along Biscayne Bay and out on the low sandbar of Miami Beach as fast as concrete could be poured. And almost none of them had the first idea what a hurricane was. They had moved to a beautiful subtropical coast in the middle of hurricane season with no memory of a storm. No family stories, no instinct, nothing. The city had roughly quadrupled in population in a handful of years, which means the overwhelming majority of the people living on that exposed coast in September of 1926 had never once been through what the coast could do. The storm that found them came in fast in the pre-dawn dark of September the 18th. A major hurricane driving straight into Miami and Miami Beach with winds well over 100 miles an hour and a surge that pushed Biscayne Bay up over the causeways and into the streets. That first assault was terrible enough, and for people who did not understand hurricanes, it must have seemed like the end of the world. And then, after a couple of hours of that fury, the wind stopped. Completely. The sky lightened. The rain quit. An eerie, beautiful calm settled over the wrecked city, and the newcomers, who had never heard of the eye of a hurricane, did the most human thing imaginable. They thought it was over. They came out. People walked out into the streets to look at the damage. They went to check on neighbors, to find family, to gawk at the wreckage in the strange, still air. In the deadliest single decision of the whole disaster, some of them started across the causeway between Miami Beach and the mainland, believing the storm had passed and it was safe to cross the open water back to the city. What they did not know, what nobody had told them, was that they were standing inside the eye. The center of the hurricane was passing directly over them, a ring of calm perhaps 20 or 30 miles across, and on the far side of that calm the wind was waiting, blowing just as hard as before, but now from the opposite direction. The lull lasted only about 35 minutes, and then the back wall of the eye arrived, and the wind came back in an instant, from the other side, at full hurricane force, and it caught them in the open, on the streets, on the causeway, out of shelter. That is when a great many of the roughly 100 people who died in Miami proper were killed, out in the open during the second half of the storm, struck by flying debris or swept off the causeway and drowned in the bay they had thought was safe to cross. The Red Cross put the official death toll of the whole storm at 372, with more than 6,000 injured, and even that number is considered low by many historians, because the transient, booming, poorly counted population of that coast made an accurate tally impossible. The land boom collapsed within a year, partly because of the storm, and Miami spent the next decade in a depression that arrived early and stayed late. And here is the insight the 1926 storm adds, the thing that makes it more than just an earlier disaster on the same coast. The people who died in the eye were not killed by ignorance of the sea in the way the drowning tourist is. They were killed by a specific teachable fact about how a hurricane is built that no one had taught them, because they were new, because the coast had filled up with people faster than knowledge of the coast could spread through them. The danger was not hidden in the geography this time. It was hidden in the gap between how fast people arrived and how slowly they learned. A coast can grow its population faster than it can grow its wisdom, and when it does, the storm collects the difference. That is a lesson Florida would have every chance to learn, and would keep failing to learn, all the way up to the crowded barrier islands of the present day. But if 1926 proved that a coast full of the unprepared could be caught out by a storm's own hidden anatomy, the sea had been proving a colder, older version of the same lesson much farther south, for much longer, to people who were not amateurs at all. Because before the Florida coast ever drowned a tourist or fooled a newcomer, it had spent centuries destroying the most skilled professional mariners in the world, on a reef most of them never saw coming, in the exact waters where the peninsula finally runs out. The Florida Keys sit astride one of the great highways of world shipping. For centuries, everything moving from the Gulf of Mexico, from New Orleans in Mexico and the Western Caribbean, out to the Atlantic and onto the ports of the eastern seaboard and Europe, had to funnel through the Straits of Florida, the narrow channel between the Keys and Cuba. And that channel is a trap built into the map. The Gulf Stream runs through it, a river of ocean moving hard and fast in one direction, shoving ships off their intended course. On the other side, hemming the ships in, lies the Florida Reef, the only living coral barrier reef in the continental United States, running for miles just offshore of the Keys, lurking a few feet under a warm, clear, calm, innocent-looking surface. It is the same lie the tourist beaches tell, told to sea captains instead of swimmers. The water over that reef looks like the safest, most beautiful water in the world. It is shallow enough to tear the bottom out of a ship. So the Keys became one of the most notorious ship killers on the planet, and the numbers from the boom years of sail are staggering. In the peak decades of the 19th century, an average of about one vessel a week wrecked on the Florida Reef. One a week. Ships driven onto the coral by the Gulf Stream, by storms, by the simple difficulty of navigating a narrow, current-swept channel with a reef on one side, night after night, year after year, piling up on the shallow rock in the dark. It was so constant, so reliable, that an entire economy grew up around it. The people of Key West became wreckers, professional salvagers who kept fast boats ready and raced out to stricken ships to save the crew and, more to the point, to salvage the cargo, for which they were paid a share of the value by the courts. Wrecking was legal, it was licensed, and it was so lucrative that it made Key West, this tiny island at the very end of the country, into the richest city per person in the entire United States for a stretch of the 1800s. A town got wealthy on the sheer dependability of the coast's ability to destroy ships. Think about what that requires. To build a permanent, prosperous industry on shipwrecks, you need shipwrecks to keep happening, on schedule, more or less forever. And that is exactly what the reef delivered. The most skilled navigators of the age. Professional captains with charts and experience and every incentive in the world not to lose their ship, kept losing their ships there anyway, because the combination of the choke point, the current, and the hidden shallow reef was more than seamanship could reliably overcome. This was not a coast that fooled only amateurs. It defeated experts constantly for generations. The government's answer was the same kind of answer we still reach for today. Better information, warnings. They built lighthouses out on the reef itself, tall iron towers standing in the shallow water, throwing a beam to mark the danger and guide ships around it. The 19th century's version of a rip current flag or a hurricane forecast. And the lighthouses helped, genuinely, the way modern warnings help. Fewer ships hit the reef once they could see it marked in the dark. The wreckers of Key West actually resented the lighthouses, because every light that went up meant fewer wrecks and less salvage, less of their strange dark harvest. But notice the shape of it, because you have seen this shape already. The information reduced the toll. It did not remove the reef. The coral was still there, still shallow, still lethal to any ship that ended up on it, and what finally cut the wrecking down was not the lighthouses alone, but the arrival of a new technology. The steamship, which was powerful and maneuverable enough to hold its course against the Gulf Stream in a way that sailing ships never could. A better engine did what a warning could not. It changed what the ships were able to attempt against the current. You can still see the government's answer standing out there in the water today, if you take a boat out over the reef off the upper Keys. Tall skeletal iron towers rise straight out of the shallow sea, miles from any land, braced on legs screwed into the coral. These are the reef lights, a chain of them built through the middle of the 19th century to mark the deadliest stretches of the barrier. Carrisfort Reef, off Key Largo, was among the first, lit in the 1850s on the very shoal that had claimed the frigate whose wreck gave the reef its name. Farther down the chain rose Alligator Reef Light, standing in open water off Islamorada, on the same waters that the 1935 hurricane would drown 80 years later. Each of these towers was placed at a spot that had already killed enough ships to justify the enormous expense of building a lighthouse on a reef in the open ocean, which tells you, better than any number, just how routine the destruction was. The lights worked in the way that warnings work. A captain who could see Carrisfort or Alligator Reef flashing in the dark could give the shoal a wide berth, and fewer ships tore their hulls open on the coral once the reef was lit. But the tower did not change the coral. It only told you where the coral was. And the men of Key West, the wreckers whose whole prosperity depended on ships continuing to founder, watched every new lighthouse go up with dread, because each one meant fewer wrecks and a leaner harvest. Their livelihood was a direct measure of the coast's lethality, and they could feel it declining light by light. It is a strange and honest measure of the place, that there was once a class of people who got rich on how reliably the beautiful shallow water destroyed the vessels that trusted it, and who mourned every improvement that made the sea a little safer. And that is worth holding on to as we come back to the people, because it is the oldest verified instance in this whole story of the pattern that runs through all of it. The Florida coast presents a beautiful, calm, warm surface with a hard hidden edge just beneath it. Better information reduces the deaths, but never removes the edge. And each new technology that seems to conquer the danger, the steamship, the forecast, the rescue helicopter, mostly just changes what people are willing to attempt, which tends, in the end, to put more of them closer to the same edge. The wreckers understood something the tourists never will. On this coast, the calm, clear water over the shallow bottom is not the safe part. It is the whole danger wearing its most reassuring face, which is the exact coast, the low chain of reef-ringed islands at the bottom of the state, where the worst single day in Florida's history was waiting. The Florida Keys are the most exposed inhabited ground in the country. They are a chain of low coral and limestone islands curving southwest off the tip of the peninsula, out into the open water between the Atlantic and the Gulf, and most of them rise only a handful of feet above the sea. On some of the keys, high ground means 5 or 6 feet. There is nowhere to go up. There is no hill to climb, no second story of rock to shelter behind. When the water decides to rise, the land simply is not tall enough to argue, and everyone on it is standing, in effect, on a sandbar in the middle of the ocean. That is the constraint. Hold on to it, because in 1935 it becomes the whole story. In the summer of that year, there were work camps strung along the upper keys, on Windley Key and lower Metacom Key, near the little settlements around Islamorada. The men in those camps were World War I veterans. Many of them had been part of the Bonus Army, the veterans who had marched on Washington in the depths of the Depression to demand early payment of a bonus they had been promised for their service, and who had been driven out of the capital by troops. The federal government, looking for something to do with thousands of unemployed and increasingly angry ex-soldiers, put them to work on relief projects. In the Keys, the project was a highway, an extension of the road that would eventually run all the way down the island chain to Key West, built alongside Henry Flagler's famous Overseas Railroad, the railroad that had already done the seemingly impossible by laying track across open water from island to island. So the veterans lived in the camps, in flimsy wooden buildings, frame shacks really, and they built road, and they were paid about $30 a month, and they were, without any of them choosing it, sitting on the lowest, most exposed, least defensible ground in the United States during the peak of hurricane season. The human objective was simple and reasonable: build a road, earn the wage, get through the season. There was nothing reckless in it from the men's point of view. They were where they had been sent, and in the last days of August 1935, when a weak tropical disturbance was noted out east of the Bahamas, there was no reason for any of them to think it had their names on it. The forecasting of the era was primitive by our standards. There were no satellites, no reconnaissance aircraft yet flying into storms, no radar. Forecasters worked from scattered ship reports and coastal observations, and a small storm moving through the Bahamas in that era could be badly underestimated. Its position uncertain, its strength a guess, its track a line drawn with a great deal of hope. The early read on this system was that it was minor, and that it would likely pass south of the Keys and swing up into the Gulf. That was the first interpretation. It was wrong, and it was wrong in the most dangerous possible direction. Because over the warm, shallow water of the Florida Straits, in the last day and a half before landfall, this modest disturbance did something that still ranks among the most extreme intensifications ever observed in the Atlantic. It exploded. Warm water is the fuel of a hurricane, and the water there was hot and rich in energy, and the storm drank it and deepened with terrifying speed, its central pressure falling and falling, its winds accelerating past major hurricane strength and then past anything anyone in the Keys had lived through. By the time it reached the islands on the evening of September the 2nd, 1935, it was a Category 5, the first Category 5 hurricane ever recorded to strike the United States. Its central pressure bottomed out around 892 millibars, and that number is not trivia. It is still, nearly a century later, the lowest barometric pressure ever measured at landfall for any hurricane in the entire Western Hemisphere. Nothing that has hit the Americas since, not Camille, not Andrew, not Katrina, not Michael, has come ashore with a lower pressure. The strongest storm ever to make landfall in the United States did it on the lowest, flattest, most crowded with stranded men ground in the country, and it did it before the people in charge understood what was coming. By the time the danger was clear, the options were already closing, This is the point of no return, and it did not arrive with the storm. It arrived earlier, in the hours when someone finally understood that the camps had to be evacuated and realized there was only one way to do it. The men on the Keys had no cars sufficient to move hundreds of people, and even if they had, the highway was unfinished. The lifeline in and out of the islands was the railroad, so the plan, the only plan, was a rescue train. A locomotive and a string of passenger cars would be sent down from the mainland, from the Miami area, run out along Flagler's tracks across the water to the camps, load the veterans and the civilian residents, and haul them back to high ground before the sea came up. Everything about that plan was reasonable. Everything about it also depended on timing that no one controlled, and the storm was not cooperating. The train was delayed getting started, tangled in the ordinary friction of a holiday weekend, and the difficulty of assembling a crew and equipment on short notice. When it finally rolled south, it was running into weather that was already deteriorating, wind rising, rain thickening, the barometer falling ahead of it. It made its way down the chain, slower than anyone wanted, and around 8:15 in the evening, it reached Islamorada, where it stopped to take on the people waiting there, including relief administrators like Ray Sheldon, who had been trying to manage the evacuation. And that is the moment the sea arrived. The storm surge is the killer in a hurricane like this one, more than the wind. And the surge here was monstrous. Driven by that record low pressure and those extreme winds pushing across shallow water, a wall of ocean estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 feet high. Remember the ground. Remember that high on these islands means 5 or 6 feet. A surge of 18 feet does not flood such a place. It erases it. It goes completely over the top of the land and keeps going. And everything not anchored to the bedrock goes with it. The wooden camps, the frame shacks the veterans slept in, were gone in the first minutes, disintegrated and swept into the sea and the mangroves with the men inside them. There was no high ground to run to because there was no high ground at all. The train did not save them. The train became part of the disaster. When the surge hit Islamorada, the water and the wind, with gusts likely around 200 miles an hour, struck the standing string of cars broadside. Witnesses and investigators later described the passenger cars being swept off the tracks and rolled, tumbled off the rails like something weightless. Every car was knocked from the line. Only the locomotive itself, 160 tons of steel, was heavy enough to stay upright on the rails, and it stood there alone in the storm, while the cars it had come to fill were scattered. The rescue had arrived. It had reached the very place it was sent to save. And it could not do the thing it came to do, because the same water that made the rescue necessary made the rescue impossible in the same instant. Communication had not failed. The train had not failed to arrive. The problem was never information or effort. The problem was that the physical event was larger than any response the era could mount, and it closed the last door at the exact moment help was reaching for the handle. The precise death toll will never be known, and the honest sources say so. The official count settled around 408 dead. Other careful estimates run higher, to 485 or beyond, because record-keeping in the camps was poor, some victims were never found, and the sea took people whose names were never firmly on any list. Of the dead, something like 260 were the veterans, the bonus army men. Drowned and battered in the shacks the government had housed them in, on that low ground in hurricane season. Bodies were recovered for days, some far out in the mangroves and the shallows. Many never recovered at all. It remains one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history, and the single deadliest natural disaster ever to strike the Florida Keys. What happened afterward is the part that turns a tragedy into an indictment, and it is where a specific, famous, verifiable voice enters the record. Ernest Hemingway was living in Key West at the time, not far up the chain. In the days after the storm, he went out to the Keys. into the aftermath, and he saw the dead. He was so enraged by what he saw and by what he understood about how it had happened that he wrote an article, published in the magazine New Masses, on September the 17th, 1935. He had titled it, in his own hand, with a blunt question, and the editors sharpened it into the title it is known by now: Who Murdered the Vets? It is not gentle. Hemingway's central charge was a demand for accountability, and he framed it as a question that still lands. Who, he asked, sent nearly 1,000 war veterans to live in frame shacks on the Florida Keys in the hurricane months? The Weather Bureau had issued warnings. The men had not been moved in time. To Hemingway, this was not an act of God visited on the innocent. It was a decision, or a failure to decide, that had put hundreds of powerless men in the path of a known seasonal danger and left them there. The days after the storm are their own kind of proof, because they show how completely the geography defeats not just rescue, but even the ordinary human business of burying the dead. The bodies were everywhere and nowhere. The surge that had swept the camps into the sea had carried the dead out with the wreckage and then dropped them, scattered for miles through the mangrove thickets and the shallows and the tangled debris. So many of them that the living could not find them fast enough. And in the subtropical September heat, the recovery became a public health emergency of its own. By the third day, rescue workers reported that the corpses had begun to swell and split open in the sun. There was no way to move them all to burial in time, no dry high ground to bury them in, no infrastructure left standing to do it with. So on September the 6th, 4 days after the storm, the governor ordered the dead cremated where they lay, to stop disease from finishing what the hurricane had started. The bodies were stacked and burned on pyres in several locations across the Keys. At the pyres, a rabbi, a priest, and a Protestant minister stood together with a civilian official and a National Guardsman, and military honors were given. A rifle salute fired over men who had already survived one war and died building a road. 2 years later, in 1937, they built a monument at Islamorada, on the ground the storm had swept bare. More than 4,000 people came for the unveiling. It is a simple stone marker with a frieze carved into it, palm trees bending under curling waves, the wind made permanent in rock, and set into the ground in front of it, under a ceramic tile mural of the island chain, there is a crypt, and inside the crypt are the ashes of around 300 of the dead, gathered from the funeral pyres. The final death toll of the storm is still given as a range, commonly around 408 and sometimes higher, past 480, because the sea took people who were never counted and the fire took people who were never named. Some of the men in that crypt are known only as ashes from a pyre on a key. That is what an 18-foot surge over 5 feet of land does. It does not just kill people, it erases the record of who they were. And that is what the 1935 hurricane proves, that the drownings and the sharks and the lightning could not, because it operates at a scale they never reach. The low, flat, welcoming geography that draws people to the Florida coast, the same gentle relationship with the sea that makes the Keys a paradise, is the exact feature that traps them when the water rises, because there is no up. And it proves something even harder about rescue. A rescue is not a magic word. It is a physical operation that has to travel through the same space and the same weather as the disaster it is trying to undo. And when the event is large enough, the rescue arrives into the teeth of the thing and is destroyed by it. The train reached Islamorada. That was not the failure. The failure was that reaching Islamorada in an 18-foot surge was not a rescue. It was 260 men in shacks and a scatter of rail cars in the mangroves, and a locomotive standing alone on bent track in the dark. Now you would think that is the kind of catastrophe a country learns from permanently. You would think that the combination of low ground, hurricane season, and inadequate warning, having killed on that scale, becomes the exact problem a century of science and engineering exists to solve. And in fairness, almost everything about how we see storms has changed since 1935. We got the tools the veterans never had. We got aircraft that fly into the eye and measure the pressure directly. We got radar, then satellites watching every system from birth, then computer models that can project a track days in advance. By our time, a storm cannot sneak up on the Florida coast the way that one snuck up on the Keys. We would see it coming. We would name it while it was still a smudge off Africa. We would know its pressure and its winds and its likely landfall with a precision the forecasters of 1935 could only dream about. Surely that changes the outcome. Surely knowing is the whole battle. So hold that confidence in your hands for a moment. Then come forward 87 years to another low Florida coast, another barrier island, another wall of water, and a storm that everyone everywhere saw coming for days. And ask yourself why people still drowned in their own homes. Hurricane Ian formed in the Caribbean in late September of 2022, and from almost the moment it had a name, it was one of the most heavily watched storms on Earth. This was the machinery working exactly as designed. The National Hurricane Center tracked it continuously. Reconnaissance aircraft flew into it and reported its pressure and winds directly. Satellites imaged it hour by hour. The computer models ran and re-ran its likely path, and for days before it arrived, everyone on Florida's Gulf Coast was told, in plain language and with steadily narrowing uncertainty, that a major hurricane was coming, and roughly where it would strike. There was no ambiguity of the 1935 kind. There was no small storm that vanished off the map and came back a monster. This was a monster the whole country could see in color, from space, with days to spare. Ian came ashore on the afternoon of September the 28th, 2022, near Cayo Costa, a barrier island on the southwest Gulf Coast, around 10 past 3 in the afternoon. It was a Category 4, with sustained winds around 150 miles an hour, at the very top of that category, and close to the threshold of Category 5. And its target was, once again, exactly the kind of geography that has run through this entire story. The southwest Florida coast around Fort Myers is a maze of low barrier islands and sandy spits. Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, Captiva, Estero Island, places that sit a few feet above the Gulf, densely built with homes and condominiums and mobile home parks, connected to the mainland by a small number of bridges and causeways. Beautiful, valuable, crowded, and low. The same trade the state has always made. The closer you build to the water, the better the view, and the higher the price, and the greater the exposure, right up until the water comes to collect. The killer, again, was the surge. Ian pushed a catastrophic storm surge into the coast, in places 12 to 18 feet of ocean above the normal ground level, driven ashore by that enormous wind field across the shallow shelf. In Fort Myers, the water reached a level that set a local record. On the barrier islands, the surge did what an 18-foot surge does to ground that is only a few feet high. It went over the islands. Fort Myers Beach, a long, low island town, was inundated and in places scoured down to slabs. On Sanibel, the causeway, the single road connecting the island to the mainland, broke apart in multiple places. Sections of it dropped into the water, cutting the island off entirely. That detail should sound familiar. It is 1935's problem in a modern frame. The one land route out failed under the storm, and anyone who had not left before it broke was now stranded on a barrier island in a major hurricane, exactly as the veterans had been stranded on the Keys, except these people had watched the storm approach on television for the better part of a week. Which brings us to the number that should not exist. Ian killed around 150 people in Florida, one of the deadliest hurricanes to strike the state in generations, and a very large share of those deaths were drownings. People who died in the surge. Many of them inside their own homes, on the barrier islands, and in the low neighborhoods along the coast. not people caught unaware by a storm no one saw. People who lived in a place that had been told for days, in the strongest terms the forecasting system knows how to produce, that a deadly surge was coming. The warning worked. The warning was, by any historical standard, magnificent, and people drowned anyway. So the obvious, uncomfortable question is the one the whole modern half of this story has been building toward. If we saw it coming, why did they die? The answer is not that the people were stupid, and it is important to be precise about this because the easy version, the version where victims simply ignored a clear order and got what was coming, is both cruel and wrong. Look at what a warning actually asks of a human being and where its limits are, and the deaths stop looking like foolishness and start looking like the predictable output of the same system that has been running for a century. Start with what the forecast could and could not do. For days, the track guidance on Ian had genuine uncertainty about exactly where the center would come ashore. Earlier in the storm's approach, a good deal of the forecast cone was pointed farther north toward the Tampa Bay area, and a great many people around Fort Myers spent the early part of the week reasonably believing the worst of it would pass to their north. When the track shifted south and settled onto Lee County, the window to act on that new information was shorter than it had been for the people up in Tampa. The forecast was not wrong, the cone did its job, but a forecast that correctly says a storm might hit any of several places cannot give every one of those places the same amount of certain warning time. Somebody is always on the part of the cone that firms up late, and this time it was one of the most crowded, lowest barrier coasts in the state. That is the modern version of the 1935 timing failure. In 1935, the storm outran the primitive forecast. In 2022, the forecast was superb, but the certainty about this particular coastline still arrived with less lead time than the people there needed to all get out. Because certainty in a hurricane forecast is a thing that builds slowly and finishes late. Then there is the physical reality of evacuation itself, which is the part people who have never done it underestimate. Evacuating a barrier island is not flipping a switch. It means tens of thousands of people trying to move across a small number of bridges and causeways in the same hours, into traffic, away from home. Many of them elderly, many with limited money or mobility or nowhere obvious to go. Many of them having lived through prior storms that turned out to be less than the forecast feared. Every coast that cries wolf, even correctly, trains its residents in a quiet, dangerous lesson. Last time they said get out, and it was fine. And once the surge is actually rising, the choice to leave is gone. You cannot drive off a barrier island through water already over the road, and you certainly cannot once the causeway has broken. The option to evacuate has a closing time, and the closing time comes before the storm. And a person who is still weighing the decision when the water starts coming up has already, without knowing it, run out of choices. That is the point of no return, and in a modern hurricane, it can pass in the calm before the worst of it, on a street that still looks passable, hours before the real danger arrives. So watch the shape of the modern rescue, because it repeats the oldest lesson in this story in the most advanced possible setting. The distress calls during Ian were not lost. People inside flooding homes on the barrier islands called for help, and the calls were received, and everyone on the other end knew exactly where they were and exactly what was happening. And through the height of the storm, help could not come. You cannot fly a rescue helicopter into a 150-mile-an-hour wind. You cannot send a boat into a surge full of floating cars and collapsed buildings and live power lines in the dark. You cannot drive across a causeway that is underwater or gone. The most sophisticated emergency response system in the world, with perfect information about the victims and their locations, had to sit and wait for the storm to pass before it could reach the people it could hear, because the same physics that was drowning them was also a wall that no asset could cross while it was happening. The rescue did not fail for lack of knowing. It was held back by the exact same force it was trying to fight. Everyone with the training and the equipment to reach those people was pinned down, watching the clock, waiting for the wind to fall far enough to let them move. Because that is the part people misunderstand about a modern rescue. It is not a single act. It is a sequence. And every step of that sequence took time the people in the water did not have. Recognition was never the missing piece, as we have seen. The next steps were: authorization and preparation came first, the machinery of a state and a federal response spinning up, more than 5,000 National Guard troops mobilized, Coast Guard air crews staged, urban search and rescue teams, and Miami-Dade fire rescue moving toward the coast. Then travel, and here the geography reasserted itself exactly as it had in 1935, because you cannot drive to a place whose only road is at the bottom of the bay. Sanibel, with its roughly 6,000 permanent residents, was an island again in the oldest sense, cut off, reachable only by boat or by air. So the approach had to be made by helicopter and by shallow draft boat, hovering over roofs, picking through canals full of sunken vessels and floating debris and downed power lines, one structure at a time. And only then, after all of that, could transfer happen, the actual lifting of a human being off a roof or out of an attic and into a basket or a boat. And it happened not during the emergency, but in the long days after it, because that is when the air was flyable and the water was navigable. In the first day or two, the official rescue tallies were in the hundreds, 600, 700 people pulled out across Lee and Charlotte counties, and the number kept climbing through the week as crews reached islands and neighborhoods that had been unreachable at the height of the storm. People had spent the night of the storm, and in some cases days after it, in second-story rooms and on rooftops, in the heat, without power or clean water, waiting for the sound of a rotor. The rescue was enormous and competent, and in the end it saved a great many lives. But notice what it could not do. It could not be there during the surge. The exact hours when people were drowning inside their homes were the exact hours when no helicopter could fly and no boat could launch. And so the largest and most sophisticated rescue apparatus in the world did what the rescue train did in 1935. It arrived at the edge of the disaster and waited for the water to let it in. And here is the part of Ian that most people outside Florida never registered, because the cameras were all pointed at the shattered barrier islands. The storm did not stop killing when it crossed the coast. It slowed down. Ian was a slow mover, crawling rather than racing, and a slow hurricane is a rain machine, sitting over the land hour after hour and wringing itself out. It dumped staggering amounts of water on the peninsula, more than 20 inches in less than a day across parts of southwest and central Florida. And near New Smyrna Beach, up on the Atlantic side, rain gauges caught close to 30 inches. That water had to go somewhere, and it went into the rivers. And the rivers rose, not during the storm, but in the days and even weeks after it, long after the wind was gone and the sky was blue again. So a second disaster unfolded inland, on the other side of the state, far from any beach. As Ian crawled up the middle of the peninsula, the rivers of central Florida, the Peace, the Miaka, the St. Johns, crested at record levels, some of them higher than any flood ever recorded on them. Whole inland towns that had felt safe, that were nowhere near the coast anyone worried about, went underwater from the swollen rivers, and people who had watched the storm hit the Gulf Coast on television found the flood coming for their own houses days later. In one town, the water rose so high and the roads vanished so completely that the rescue was carried out by a volunteer flotilla of airboats, civilians with shallow draft boats going house to house, because the official vehicles could not reach the trapped. On some rivers, the flood stage did not peak until well over a week after landfall, and stayed dangerous for weeks more. Look at how the deaths broke down, and the point becomes impossible to argue with. When the National Hurricane Center finished its analysis, It attributed the largest share of the direct deaths to storm surge, the wall of ocean on the barrier islands. But the next causes down the list were freshwater flooding from those inland rivers, and marine incidents, and rough surf. Add them together, and nearly every confirmed direct death in Hurricane Ian came from water in one form or another, at the coast or far from it, during the storm, or a week after it had passed. That is the whole system in a single storm. The same warm gulf that fed the surge fed the rain. The same low, flat state that cannot stop the ocean at its edge cannot drain the rivers in its middle. And the danger did not respect the coastline at all. It came ashore as a surge, moved inland as a flood, and kept killing people days later and 100 miles away, in living rooms that had never once thought of themselves as beachfront. And here is the reversal that closes the loop the 1935 story opened, the one about whether better warning would end the dying. Better warning did not shrink the surge. It did not raise the islands. It did not widen the causeways or slow the rate at which a coast can be evacuated. It gave people more information, and more information is genuinely worth a great deal. It certainly saved many thousands of lives that would have been lost in a 1935-style surprise. But it left the underlying machine completely intact, and then it sat on top of a change the forecasters cannot control at all, which is that far more people now live on that low coast than ever lived there before. Every decade, the barrier islands get more crowded, the coastal counties get more valuable, more homes go up a few feet above the Gulf, on ground that floods. So the warning improved, and the exposure exploded, and the two trends ran against each other. And the result is a storm that everyone saw coming for a week that still killed about 150 people. We did not beat the trap. We got better at describing it, while more of us moved inside it. If Hurricane Ian showed you one way the modern system fails, a track that firms up onto a crowded coast later than that coast needs, then go back 4 years, to the same panhandle beaches where this whole story of drownings began, and look at the other way it fails. Because in October of 2018, that coast was hit by Hurricane Michael, and Michael exposed a different limit of all our watching, one that has nothing to do with uncertainty about where a storm will go, and everything to do with how fast the warm Gulf can turn a manageable storm into an unsurvivable one. Michael was not a surprise in the 1935 sense. Everyone saw it coming up from the Caribbean. But watch what it did on the way. It crossed the same hot Gulf water that fuels everything in this story, and it drank that heat and intensified with a violence that the forecasts, even the good modern forecasts, struggled to keep pace with. In a single 72-hour stretch, it went from a weak tropical depression to a hurricane pushing 145 miles an hour, and in one 6-hour span near the end, it leapt from a Category 2 to a Category 4, strengthening right up to the instant it touched land instead of weakening the way storms often do at the coast. It came ashore near Mexico Beach, a small, low town on the Panhandle coast, around 1:30 in the afternoon on October the 10th, 2018. At the time, it was called a Category 4. Months later, after the National Hurricane Center went back through all the data, the storm was upgraded to a Category 5 at landfall, with sustained winds around 160 miles an hour. That upgrade made Michael the strongest hurricane ever recorded to strike the Florida Panhandle, and only the second Category 5 ever to hit the northern Gulf Coast in the entire history of records, the first having been Camille, back in 1969. Here is why the speed of that intensification is the whole point. A storm that spends days as a known, stable Category 2 gives a coast a certain kind of decision. People look at a Category 2 forecast, and many of them, reasonably, decide to ride it out, because they have ridden out a Category 2 before, and their house is still standing. Michael did not give them a stable forecast to reason about. It offered a serious but survivable-sounding storm one day and delivered a top-of-the-scale monster a day later. And it did the worst of that transformation in the final hours, when there was the least time left to change a decision already made. A family that boarded up for a strong storm and chose to stay woke up in the path of the most powerful hurricane the region had ever seen. The satellites saw all of it. The forecasters said with rising alarm that it was strengthening fast, but knowing a storm is exploding 24 hours out does not give the people in its path the 72 hours they would need to calmly leave. And it does not undo a decision to stay that was made when the storm still looked like something they could handle. The Gulf's warm water, the same water that makes the beaches feel like a bath, and the same water that turned a nothing disturbance into the 1935 monster, supercharged Michael at the last possible moment, and the most advanced observation network ever built could only watch it happen and shout. What that storm did to Mexico Beach is the clearest picture in this entire story of what these forces actually mean, stripped of statistics. This was a different weapon than Ian's slow drowning surge, though it brought surge too, 9 to 14 feet of it along that stretch of coast. Michael was wind as much as water, 160 miles an hour of it, and it did not flood Mexico Beach so much as disassemble it. Whole blocks of houses were reduced to bare concrete slabs and scattered lumber, as if the town had been picked up and shaken apart. It is the same low panhandle coast, a short drive from the Panama City beach sand where tourists drown in rip currents one at a time on calm summer days, and it demonstrates the range of the same underlying system. On an ordinary July afternoon, that coast takes a single swimmer with an invisible current. On an October afternoon, it can take an entire town with a wall of wind and water that the warm Gulf built in 3 days. Michael directly killed at least 16 people and was blamed for dozens more deaths in its aftermath, a toll that stayed lower than it might have only because a great many people did evacuate, and because the very worst of the wind hit a stretch of coast less densely packed than Fort Myers. It was not restraint on the storm's part. It was luck about where the strongest core came ashore, and luck is not a coastal defense system. Line the 3 storms up, and the pattern is impossible to miss, and it is not a pattern of ignorance being slowly cured by technology. In 1935, the storm beat the forecast because there was barely a forecast, and 400 people died on ground too low to survive a surge, with a rescue that arrived into the teeth of it. In 2018, the forecast existed and was good, and the warm Gulf still intensified the storm faster than any warning could translate into escape, and a town on that same low coast was erased. In 2022, the forecast was superb and days ahead, and the water still killed about 150 people because certainty about the exact coast came late, because evacuating a crowded low island takes longer than a storm will wait, and because the rescue, again, could not cross the water until the water was done. Different centuries, wildly different technology. The same low ground, the same warm water, the same trap, and each time a rescue that could reach the edge of the disaster and not the middle of it. There is one more piece to fit before the whole machine is on the table, and it is the piece that guarantees the story never ends, because it explains why the coast fills back up every single time it is emptied. After a storm like Michael or Ian tears through, you would expect people to leave the barrier islands for good. A rational observer seeing a town scraped down to slabs would assume nobody rebuilds on that exact sand. And yet, within months, the rebuilding starts, in the same spot, a few feet above the same water, often bigger and more expensive than before. Fort Myers Beach came back. Mexico Beach came back. Sanibel came back. The people who lost everything, or the people who bought the lots from them, put the houses right back on the ground the sea had just proven it could cross. They do it for a reason, and the reason is the same one that has run under this entire story. from the first calm turquoise morning. The coast is valuable for exactly the features that make it dangerous. The warm, shallow water, the soft, low beach, the barrier island a few feet above a gentle gulf, these are not the price you pay for the view. They are the view. They are the product. A house on a low barrier island floods because it is close to the water, and it is worth a fortune because it is close to the water. And those are not two facts. They are one fact seen from two sides. You cannot buy the paradise without buying the exposure, because the paradise is the exposure. So the ground that drowns people is also the most sought after and most expensive ground in the state. And demand for it does not fall after a disaster. It barely pauses. And the numbers of people exposed keep climbing, decade over decade, no matter what the sea does. Florida keeps growing, faster than almost anywhere in the country, and a huge share of that growth crowds toward the coast, into the counties and the islands most exposed to surge because that is where people want to be. The state has poured enormous value onto its most vulnerable ground, so much that the cost of insuring it has become a crisis of its own. Premiums soaring, insurers pulling out, because the companies can do the arithmetic on how often that ground floods, even if the buyers would rather not. The warnings got better, the building codes got stricter, the forecasts bought people time, but underneath all of it, the exposure, the sheer number of human beings and homes sitting on low, warm coast has done nothing but rise. Every improvement in safety has been met and overmatched by an increase in the number of people standing in harm's way. And so the toll, in the long run, does not fall the way all that technology promises it should. There are simply more of us on the edge than ever before, and more arriving every year, drawn by the same warmth and the same beauty and the same soft, forgiving-looking water that has been the bait in the trap the entire time. And there is a hard structural reason the rescuers can never simply be everywhere, a reason written into the same geography that started all of this. Florida has more shoreline than any state but Alaska, well over 8,000 miles of tidal coast, when you trace every bay and island and inlet, and even the open ocean beach, the part with sand and swimmers, runs for many hundreds of miles up both coasts. You cannot put a lifeguard tower on all of it. The math does not work, and it never will. A guarded beach means a stretch of a few hundred yards, watched by trained people, backed by trucks and rescue boards and radios, and those beaches are islands of safety in an ocean of open, unwatched sand. Step a mile down the shore from the last tower, and you are in water that is physically identical, with the same bars and the same channels, and nobody is coming inside your 90-second window because nobody is watching. The safety is not a property of the water. It is a property of a very small, very expensive patch of human attention, and there is only so much of it to go around. The offshore picture is the same problem drawn at a larger scale. The Coast Guard sectors that cover Florida's waters are responsible for enormous territories, tens of thousands of square miles of Gulf and Atlantic, patrolled by a finite number of boats and aircraft. When a call comes in from a disabled boat, or a swimmer swept out past the bars, or a family clinging to a capsized hull, the response has to travel across that space in real time, and the ocean does not pause while it travels. This is the oldest theme in the whole story, the one the rescue train taught in 1935 and the helicopters relearned in 2022. Help is not measured in whether it exists. It is measured in how far away it is when the clock starts. And on a coast this vast, with this many people spread along it, the honest answer is that for most of the water, most of the time, help is simply too far to arrive inside the handful of minutes a drowning person actually has. The warning systems, the flags, the forecasts, the patrols are all attempts to make up for a gap that cannot really be closed. The gap between the size of the coast and the speed of a rescue. Every one of them is a way of saying the same thing. We cannot reach you in time, so please do not put yourself where you would need us to. Step back now and look at the whole machine at once, because every piece is on the table, and they were never really separate killers. They were always one system wearing different masks. It begins with geography, and the geography is fixed. Florida is a low limestone shelf lying in warm water, more coastline than any other state in the lower 48, almost none of it high. On the Gulf side, the bottom slopes away so gently that the sea stacks itself into sandbars with gaps, and those gaps become the drainage channels that funnel water back out to sea. On the Atlantic side, the inlets force enormous volumes of water and fish through narrow gaps, clouding the water and drawing the animals into it. And everywhere the land is so low that when the ocean rises even a dozen feet, it does not flood the coast, it crosses it. None of that is weather. That is just the shape of the place. Sitting there on a calm day, doing nothing, waiting, then weather activates the shape. The same warm water that makes the beaches feel like a bath is the fuel that explodes a weak disturbance into a Category 5 in a day and a half. The same daily sea breezes that make the coast livable collide over the peninsula and build the thunderstorms that make it the lightning capital of the country. The ordinary, pleasant, advertised weather of Florida is the trigger. It does not fight the geography, it arms it. And then the physical forces do the actual killing. And each of them is invisible or misread right up until it is not. The rip current is a quiet river in calm water, narrow and fast and silent, pulling faster than a person can swim under a blue sky. The surge is the whole ocean standing up and walking inland over ground too low to stop it. The lightning comes down out of a clear part of the sky 10 miles ahead of the rain and finds the tallest wet thing on a flat, open beach. Not one of these announces itself the way danger is supposed to. They hide inside exactly the features that the postcard is selling. Over the top of all of that, we laid human exposure, and we laid it on thick. This is not a wild coast that people stumble onto. It is one of the most deliberately marketed shorelines on Earth, and the marketing works precisely because the danger is invisible. Tens of millions of visitors a year, many from inland, many who have never read a wave in their lives, funneled onto beaches where much of the sand has no lifeguard, and the warning is a colored flag they were never taught to read. Hundreds of thousands of new residents crowding onto barrier islands a few feet above the Gulf because the view is worth it, and the risk is a rumor, until the week it is not. The coast is valuable for the same reasons it is dangerous. The warmth, the shallowness, the beauty, the access, the very softness of the water. These are the product, and they are the mechanism, and they are the same thing. You cannot sell one without selling the other. Technology changed what we could do, and it is worth being fair about exactly what it changed and what it did not. It changed knowing. We went from a weather bureau guessing at a storm's track, from ship reports to satellites and hurricane hunters and models that see a system coming for a week. That is not nothing. It is the difference between 400 dead in the dark on the Keys and a coast that at least has the chance to run. But knowing is not the same as escaping, and every tool we built ran into a limit it could not cross. The forecast warns, but cannot manufacture the hours a crowded barrier island needs to empty. The flag informs, but cannot make a stranger from Ohio believe a warm, calm sea wants to drown him. The rescue helicopter and the rescue boat and the rescue train can all reach the edge of the disaster and then be stopped cold by the same wind and water that created it, because a rescue has to travel through the event. And when the event is large enough, it eats the rescue. That is the through line from the locomotive standing alone on the bent track in 1935 to the received distress calls that no aircraft could answer in 2022. Distance and force do not care what century it is, and history is the proof that it repeats. That is why this could not be one incident. The rip currents at Panama City Beach in 2023, and the surge on the Keys in 1935, and the drownings on Sanibel in 2022 are not three separate stories that happen to share a state. They are the same story at different scales, and in different decades the same trap, sprung again and again on new people with better equipment and worse crowding, always with the same core: low ground, warm water, hidden force, human exposure, and a rescue that arrives to find the door already shut. The eras change. The tools change. The number of people standing in the wrong place goes up. The machine underneath stays exactly the same. So go back to where we started. A flat, sunlit Gulf beach on an ordinary morning. The water is a warm turquoise sheet, barely a wave on it, clear enough to see your feet in the shallows. Down the sand, on a pole, a single flag hangs in the light air. It is not green, because on this beach, green is a color they decided they could not honestly fly. Maybe it is yellow. Maybe it is red. It moves a little in the breeze that is coming in off the water, the same breeze that will build into a thunderhead by afternoon, over the same warm sea that could deepen a storm by nightfall, above the same low sand that would vanish under a surge. Just past the last people standing in the shallows, if you knew exactly how to look, you could see it. A narrow strip where the water is a slightly different color, a little calmer, a little darker, running straight out past the sandbar. A channel. It has been there all morning. The families keep wading out toward it because it looks like the safest water on the beach. The trap has not changed at all. Only the number of people walking toward it every summer has gone up.